The C.O.R.E group, it stands for Connect, Observe, Reflect, and Empower. It's a business model based around empowering yourself through the community and finding the best ways to really express yourself and learn about yourself. And as we connect with everybody, whether it's, internally or outwardly, we learn by observing and then reflecting upon ourselves, and we become empowered, and then we can pass that along with each connection that we end up making. And Jessica Waugh and I are creating this business to really help ourselves, help others, and create a model for the hospitality industry through education, health, and wellness. So that is C.O.R.E, and that is part of the therapy that we talk about. But let's get into it. So the basics, right? What is alcohol? So it is something that we indulge in. It is something that we enjoy, maybe. But what is it? It's two of the most simplest things, and they are found abundantly on the planet. You take sugar, you take yeast, boom, you have alcohol. If anybody has the Instapots or toilet bowls, anything like that, you can take naturally occurring sugars in anything, have some naturally occurring yeast, which could even be in the air, and you have alcohol. Now, depending on what the flavor profile and what you like in life, that may be something that you want to really refine. But those are the only two things that are needed. For wine, you need natural grape sugars, and sometimes other fruits are used, but I consider wine to be something made from grapes and yeast. So the yeast takes their little time, and they go and they start eating all of the sugars. And they produce a few different things. They produce energy, which we know is heat, and they produce carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is that little gaseous kind of release. And this is the release and ethyl alcohol. So it's a really simple process, right? So you can make alcohol from anything. I have been told that there is an alcohol made from sawdust. So the pulp fibers, they have naturally occurring sugars. They in turn are turned into alcohol. The other simple explanation of how wine is made, and if I did have any winemakers on here, they would probably want to slap me, but this is the most simple way to look at it. You take the grapes, you harvest them, you crush them, you ferment that juice. You can age or not age the wine, then you bottle it, and then we enjoy it. And on that note, I hope everybody has a little something that they can toast, because that is one of the reasons that we are here today together, is to enjoy the juice and the love that we are sharing for this industry. So a high toast to you all. I've got to show some love for Grounded Wine Company for sharing a little bit of their Grenache Rosé with me. Thank you, Josh Phelps. And those two little cuties there that are censored because they're doing things that most girls never do in life, which is toot. Those are the yeast cells that are eating those sugars, and then they are releasing that CO2. All right, so a few times you're going to hear me say, what is wine? So what is wine is a complex question. So we're going to have to break it down a little bit. Now, there are 4 major types of wine, and these are all based on how the winemaking production is. We have fortified, sweet, sparkling, and still. And you'll see fortified is in a small circle because that's the least amount of production of that style or that type of wine that's made on the planet, where still wines have the largest category because that's the most that's made on the planet. And these will have usually an alcohol by volume. You'll see it written on a lot of labels as ABV, between 7 and 14%. You will definitely see wines that are well above that 14% that are still dry style of table wines, but that's a whole nother seminar, but they are still considered in the still category. So the production methods for all of these types of wine are going to potentially be very different, but they can be white, rosé, or red as well. And then our styles of wines, we can have the 4 types, again, as I said, still, sparkling, sweet, and fortified. They can be made in a variety of different styles, meaning like that sparkling, still, or such, and it can be different colors and tastes. So there are major components that would go into the impact of the finished wine. We're going to talk about these in particular: grape variety, color, body, sweetness, climate, and vintage. Because to me, those are in that primary sort of impact what we would see on a style of wine. So grape varieties. These are all different grape varieties here. Kind of cool, right? There's thousands of them, and they keep mutating, or they keep having little babies by getting crossed in these labs and such. But they all make a very unique style of wine. And the table grapes that you see in the grocery, you could, in theory, make some wine out of it. Maybe they do that in Pahrump. We're not talking anything about there, but it's very possible that you might not want to try and do that because they're very different. And it's not because, oh gosh, it's not good enough. They're just a very different profile. So in wines that are used for, grapes that are used for wines, the berries are smaller. They have a lot thicker of skins, which can help insulate, so they can have more sugar and acidity, and they contain seeds that have more sugar and acidity. And if you want to talk about varietal wines, which are varietal versus blends, you can have a single variety or you can have a blend. So if you have a blend, there's a few reasons that a winemaker may choose to use that. It could be they didn't get enough in the crop for that particular vintage, so that they need to supplement, which in historical times, that's actually what was a big thing, or things didn't ripen enough. So they needed to add something for the flavor, to add a little more richness, texture, body, color, acidity, more alcohol even to get to a point where they're allowed in the law to produce that wine. And they have a really long history in Europe to create blends because it used to be a lot cooler over there, and they needed to supplement things. And in the New World, it seemed that everybody thought, single variety, make me feel special. And, you know, it does go half and half. That's kind of a generalization, but that's how it went back then. So again, styles of wine. What goes into the style of wine? Well, color is a huge influence. So I have a rosé today, and I would say on this chart, I'm probably in the deeper salmon. And this is made from the Grenache. So when you look at color, this is determined by the grape variety or the production methods used. So I would say the production methods and the grape variety of this rosé color is definitely having an influence on that. So we're going to discuss this a little more in detail later, but the color that makes red wine red has nothing to do usually with the juice itself. So you look at a black grape, and that's what they're referred to. We usually say red grapes, but they're actually black grapes. And you look at a black grape, you pull it off the vine, you squeeze it. I mean, that's kind of mean sounding right now, but if you did that, all of that juice running down your arm would be clear, just like if you took a white grape off the vine, squeezed it, and all that juice would be clear. Now, there are exceptions. There's a handful of them on the planet. They're called Tensurier grapes, and their juice matches the skin. So if you squish them, it would run down as black juice. But rosé wines, and we'll get into this in more detail later, are made from black grapes, and they're actually left on the skins to kind of give them the color. Hence, a rosé wine that has this color could be because it's from the Grenache grape, or it could be the winemaker decided to leave it on the skins a little longer. And then we talk about body. Woo! So the body of wine. This is a fun topic, right? There's a lot more pictures on this page. So this refers to a few different things, but let's start with the amount of alcohol. If you were to have something that was at 8% alcohol by volume versus a 14% alcohol by volume, 7% is going to be really light, 14% is going to be really full bodied. And then of course you have medium bodied. And in the nerd world, we kind of like try and figure out, oh, is it medium minus, it is medium plus. But for us, we're going to talk about light, medium, or full bodied. So there's some good references. And I don't really drink milk anymore. I used to as a child, I think because I was told to. But if you don't drink milk anymore, we've got other comparatives that we can talk about to that. So you look at your skim milk, your 2%, and your whole milk, right? So skim would be your light body, 2% medium, and full bodied is your whole milk. And you remember that coating, that viscosity that happens on the palate with the full body, as opposed to that kind of lean and more crisp taste of the skim milk. And that's where you can find those comparisons. If you want to talk about your alternative milks, because a lot of people have those these days. We can talk about skim milk in the same reference of coconut juice or coconut milk. 2% would be a comparison of, say, an oat milk. And then your whole milks would be any of your nut milks, your cashew, your almond, and such like that. So if you, whichever one you indulge upon, think about those the next sip that you take of your wine and try and decipher, is this light, medium, or full body? Newer oak. So oak is a big topic. Again, another seminar we could spend, and we will if we do a tasting seminar, which that'll be coming soon. But new oak, forget the flavor part of it. Let's talk about what new oak can do. It adds weight, right? So there's natural sugars and lactones that are encased in that barrel. It's a living, breathing, pulpous kind of organism that you're putting a liquid in that's extracting things from that living organism, right? So it's going to take on some of those characteristics. And it could be that it adds sugars, those lactones and tannins that are going to create an even creamier mouthfeel, right? So that's adding weight and texture to the body of a wine. So that goes into the style that we're talking about. And if you think about this, and we'll get to that crazy picture there with the wine glass and all those funky little things in there. If you think about taking all of the alcohol and water out of the wine, right? If you were completely dry it out from those two things, you might be in the glass, if they didn't fine and filter it to crazy, you'd be left with a dry extract. So some of these dry extracts could include tannins. They could include anthocyanins, which are those beautiful color compounds that we usually find in our red wines. And then potentially those tartrates, which I've been on the floor a long time and somebody comes up and there's something in my glass, I think it's bad. And it's those little crystallized acid particles. Not a bad thing. It's not going to hurt you. I promise. And I don't promise things unless I know it. But it has a little bit of texture, right? So these little crystallized acid parts, you can see them there. That is things that are left because they didn't get fined or filtered out, or for whatever molecular reason that something happened inside the bottle and they were left there. But acidity gives wine a lot of body sort of components. So acidity can be a refreshing quality. It actually adds or should add to the overall balance of the wine, and it can actually stop the cloyingness of a high sugar content wine from feeling that way on the palate as it sears through, and it actually brings that sweetness across the tongue instead of letting it just fall flat somewhere. So acid is really important. It's also great when you're doing food and wine pairings because it can actually pick out some of those key ingredients in your foods and really either complement them or have an effect of highlighting those. But that's for another seminar too. See, we're already building the seminars here. Tannins. So tannins come from a few different things. That little grape there, tannins could come from the seeds, they could come from the skins. There's a few things that could come from the wood, but this is a very big textural element in wine. And usually we talk about tannins when we talk about red wines. It can dry the mouth out, dry the gums out, and it really becomes a detectable thing as far as the body, which becomes a style of wine. And then of course those anthocyanins, which are in the skins of the grapes, and they add to a pigment, but this also adds sometimes to this phenolic structure, which also can help a textural aspect of the wine. So back to styles of wines. Another thing that adds to the style of wine is sweetness. So we have naturally sweet sugars inside each of our grapes. Some of them have more, some of them naturally have less. And the sugar levels are going to decrease as more alcohol is produced. So remember, we have our yeast eating the sugars, and dependent on the winemaker's preference or style, she will either stop the fermentation, stop those little yeast guys from eating, or let it run its course and become an extrally, like, really bone dry style of wine, or it'll stop it first and it'll remain naturally sweet or sweeter. And those yeast cells rarely want to tolerate high alcohol levels, like above 15 to 16%. It's kind of like if you were from Minnesota, I hope I said that okay, and you traveled to Las Vegas, Nevada, and you'd never been here, and you were in the heat of summer, so it's like 110 degrees, you would probably not want to tolerate, and you would just go sit in the air conditioning. So when the yeast decide that they can't handle that anymore, they just go, I'm gonna die. It's pretty cool, right? They're just like, whatever, I'm not scared of this. So whether it's a natural process that they just get too like hot and bothered and they die, or sometimes, as I was saying, it's an unnatural process and the winemaker decides, I'm cutting you off, no more eating, you need to chill out, and I want to keep some of those sugars that are in there. And we call this either RS in the Nerdville or residual sugars. So residual, anything that's left residing in the wine after fermentation concludes. So could be on purpose or not. Sweetness of wine, as we kind of said, these things sort of fall into a Venn diagram. Sweetness can also be affected by the acidity, alcohol, and tannins. Wines are classified as dry, semi-sweet, and sweet. So climate. Climate is the continued, generally speaking, of course, because we're not going to get into a battle of whether or not climate change is real or not. I hope you all think it is. But if you don't, that's fine, because climate is an overarching concept. It's not just the 1 year's temperatures or rainstorms or heat waves. It's a generalization that describes weather patterns in a specific region that are expected. And most grapes would really like to stay between that 30 to 50 parallel, whether it's on the north or south of the equator. So if you are getting closer to the equator, it's getting hotter, right? So generally speaking, the hotter the climate, the higher your alcohol is going to be, the more sugars you're going to have. The more sugar you have, the lower your acidity is going to be. Again, generally speaking, people can manipulate, things could happen that are different, but that's a generalization. The cooler climates and even higher altitudes are going to produce lower alcohol, higher acid wines. And that's why in a lot of regions that produce white wines, it's a cooler climate, because that's what you're going for with that. And that's what a lot of white grapes can actually handle. Every grape actually has their little conditions, like they put their little thing out there and they say, this is what I accept in life, and this is what I'm going to give you. And if I don't get it, I might go and do this. So that's why certain regions have certain grape varieties that make sense to plant them there. Now, of course, you could talk about soil and the winemaker's hands, but that's what we talk about when we're talking about climate. And there are certain varieties that just don't perform well in any climatic situation. So not sure why they're being produced, but they are. So we'll give them some love. Now, there is wine being made all over the planet. There's wines being made in Russia. Cold. I mean, super cold. I'm not talking just a little cold. It's super cold, and it's colder than it is in even British Columbia and in Germany. But what they're doing is they've learned, and they have some of the oldest vines on the planet, if not the oldest recorded. So what they did is they learned how to deal with this. They would get these beautiful clay amphora, dig them deep into the ground, they'd be insulated, boom, they fermented, they got to drink and warm up. All right, so another thing that can have an effect on the styles of wine that's very important when we are drinking and indulging or buying for someone else is the vintage. So vintage has everything to do with the actual weather pattern for that harvest year. So while the grapes are starting to grow throughout that season till the time that they are brought into the crush facility, vintage has everything to do with those conditions. So this year's harvest, right, would be considered the vintage that you would see on the label. On sparkling wines, on wine lists, you know, I'm going to be truthful and very honest. When I first moved to Nevada, I would see NV. So I was like, wow, Nevada has a lot of wines. No jokes. There it is. Okay, you got something out of me. But if you see NV or even MV, those are going to stand for non-vintage or multi-vintage, meaning they had to take a handful of different blends from different vintages to make that wine. A good vintage to me is when the winemaker and his team, his family, have passion and attention. You can have somebody say, oh, it was such a horrible vintage, and they won't buy the wine, or they won't even give it a chance. I think there can be great vintages, and if a winemaking team doesn't have that passion and attention to detail, it's not a great vintage for them. So just to recap, we have all these influencers of the wine world: location, soil, grape variety, climatic and environmental conditions, production methods, human interaction. All of these things go into this crazy great word that some people don't believe in, which is called terroir. Terroir is a French term. It does not have any translation anywhere else on the planet except for those beautiful French people, but it means the whole picture. So it's not just location, soil, grape variety. It's not just those things, maybe one thing from the other circle. It's that whole thing that becomes one beautiful cycle and circle. So there you are. Now, we still haven't really told you how wine is made, right? So those are all the influences. Now we're going to talk about from vine to glass. So these are actual pictures of when I was pretending to be a winemaker in Oregon with my beautiful friend Aya Namoto, who is there, smiling so bright. We were crushing grapes with our feet. It was kind of like the I Love Lucy. It was really cold and gnarly. There were bugs everywhere, but not a pretty thing to go winemaking. But so I wanted to show you actually that I had been to a facility to make wine, and it was an amazing experience. There's a lot of dangers that go into it, and you have to learn these things, but there's a lot that you learn while you're hands-on. So these are from a vineyard called, or from a winery called Lingua Franca. It's in Eola Amity Hills in beautiful Oregon, and what a wonderful experience that we had definitely together with Master Sommelier Larry Stone. So we're very grateful to him as well. So white wine. So grapes are brought to the crush facility, hopefully in a very timely manner, because white grapes have typically thinner skins, and they will oxidize, kind of like oxidation with my wrinkles, right? You bite into an apple, it starts to brown up. That's what we don't want to have happen to any of our grapes, but especially white grapes. They're a little more susceptible to it. Typically, most all of white grapes are destemmed and then they're crushed. There are some exceptions to any rule here, or any thought process. Then the wine press will separate the juice and the skins. Again, there are some styles of white wines that become, say, like an orange wine or a gray wine, however you want to call it. And those actually will stay with the skins for a short amount of time. The juice is fermented. It could be in anything, but typically it's either in stainless steel or fiberglass or something like that, but it could be wood tanks, cement. Then if you are allowed, there's a lot of laws on the planet, you can add sugar, which is chaptalization, or you can acidify, which hopefully not a lot of people are doing. Some people say they can tell if it's acidified, but it kind of adds maybe like a little bit of fakeness to the flavor profile. Who knows? The new wine is then put into new barrels or vessels, and then it could be aged or bottled immediately. Again, white wine, it's beautiful, it's fresh. Now, there are some tendencies where you might find some different production methods which may mimic the red wine production, which is a lot more extensive. But you start with the grapes being brought to the facility in a timely manner. This is where it starts to get a little different right then and there. So red grapes are usually either partially destemmed or maybe wholly destemmed, but they could be put in there all together, meaning like the whole cluster. And, you know, the winemaker decides whether it be the vintage or the climatic influence of that year, if they're going to blend, if they want to add any stems. Stems can add tannins, they can add flavor profiles, kind of like a green, herby, kind of woodsy note, but it's up to them to decide that during that process. Then the juice is fermented on the skins. Remember we were talking about squeezing, juice running down the arm. You need to leave the skins on. So if you've ever bought those sunflowers that have those bright, like say orange colors or purple colors, you put them in the water, all of a sudden the water turns orange or purple. That's kind of the same concept. You need that maceration process so those skins can actually impart their color, those anthocyanin pigments, into the juice itself. So already you're adding things to this juice from those skins, like the tannins, the phenolics, all that good stuff. Now during fermentation, so we've done all that, then we put it off into the vessels of whatever we want to do, whether it's stainless, wood, cement, fiberglass, so forth. Then during fermentation, you have this crazy process, and I'll actually go back. You can see in that top right on my screen where all of those, and those have actually partial clusters, right? You can see some of the stems in there. And there's this great little cap that actually sits on the top of the vat. And what that does, and that's natural because all those gases, right? You're getting that little CO2 that's coming out. It's naturally bringing all those solid particles up to the top of the tank. Now it's adding a nice protective layer for the wine, but then you have to kind of think about, oh my goodness, all these things are gonna get dried out. We don't want that. Just like our face and our body, our skin, we want to stay hydrated and moisturized because we are protecting the insides, just like the grapes are doing on the top of that vat. We call that the cap, right? So you need to consistently either break that cap up by punching down into it, and it's not easy. Whew, it takes a good workout there, or you're going to pump over, which again, that is what's happening there on that top right. I'm trying to pump the juice, and you're just taking the juice from the vat and you're pumping it over and kind of giving it a nice little bath. It's actually very peaceful and meditative to me. I don't know if anybody else found that, if they ever did it, but it was fun for me. So color and tannins are even more extracted during this time, right? And the skins, juice, stems, right, if they're all present, are still left for a certain amount of time. It could be weeks that you're letting this happen, up to the winemaking team, right? All right, so the wine, and here's another, this is the punch down. So you're taking this huge thing and you're just breaking the cap up. And the reason that there's different methods, pumping over versus punching down will either increase the maceration or that soaking, or it's going to increase the amount of kind of like rough and tumble, adding some oxygen and stuff to the wine. But then you take the wine, you run it off from the skins, right? Now we're done with those things. Sometimes people make other products out of those, but then you put it into whatever other vessel that you want to. A lot of times with red wines, it goes into either big used barrels or neutral barrels, we call them, or they can go into partial or new oak barrels. So the skins are pressed off. It's made into a press wine, and that is used as a separate vessel. It's put into a separate vessel just in case they need to use it for blending later. Things happen. So mostly all red wines and some white wines, so some of the great Burgundy, Chardonnays of the world go through something called malolactic fermentation. So this is like, think of a green apple and a yellow apple. Green apple is the malic sharp acid. The yellow apple is that smooth daddy, the soft, rounded lactic acid. So the red wine, depending on how much they want it to go towards that smooth, creamy, dreamy, is how they let the malolactic fermentation, otherwise known as MLF in the Nerdville, go through that. While the wine ages, Again, it could be in barrel or the vat. There are these fine lees. So those little yeast cells, munch, 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 munch. Remember, they just decided to die because they're cool like that. Those are turning into these dead yeast cells that are left after fermentation, right? They could be utilized even more, and it's called batonnage. So batonnage is stirring of those dead yeast cells, those dead lees, right? And that just adds more complexity, more creamy dreaminess to the wine. Then it's bottled, and then hopefully we're enjoying it. All right, so rosé all day. That inspires me to take a sip. So rosé, there are 3 methods to rosé winemaking. We've got something called maceration, which we already just learned about. We've got saignée. I gave you a little phonetic spelling there. This is also known as bleeding. And then, of course, we've got something where you just blend. And blending is something that seems like a very easy thing to do, but you have to be very precise, because blending, you're adding red wine to a vat of white wine. And if you overdo it, so you've got to be very judicious on that. Maceration is taking those black grapes and you're basically letting them macerate. So it's the same concept of red winemaking. And typically what happens here is you're taking some of that macerated wine before it reaches that full color pigment and style that the winemaker wants for the red wine, and you're taking some of that off, right? And then you're using that in a separate vessel, and it becomes your rosé. Saignée method is bleeding. So the first few hours of red winemaking, you're bleeding it off again into another vat. So maceration is, your intention is truly going to be making rosé wine from these particular grapes. Bleeding is going to be taking those grapes that are made for red wine and taking them and separating them out. So some major regions that I think we find some of the great rosés that we find all over, that you can find anywhere in the stores, is France, a lot of times Provence, right? Those are our really crunchy, crisp, bright, and usually lighter in style. Loire Valley is great, and then Champagne, right? So Champagne has the greatest rosé, in my opinion. But Italy, all over Italy. But one of the biggest regions is Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, as well as in Tuscany. In Spain, again, all over the place, but Aragon, Rioja, up in Basque Country, they make great rosé chocolat, just not enough of it for me to drink all the time. And then in the United States, everywhere. Mexico's really starting to come out with some great rosés as well. So let's talk about one of my favorite things in life, sparkling wine. So how did they get so many cute bubbles into those bottles? Well, we're going to find out in just a moment. So sparkling wine methods vary. We've got quite a few of these. We're going to focus on traditional method. So if you've seen things like Petnat or Petnat, because that's usually what you see on a label, but Pétillant Naturel, or if it says ancestral method, this is the oldest sparkling wine making production on the planet. And because what you do is, what they did, they just put the wine in the bottle, put a cap on it, and it had so much sugar in the wine because they didn't have the techniques that we have, or maybe even the education. And all of a sudden it's starting to re-ferment inside the bottle. When you open it, it may still be fermenting. So that's ancestral method, AKA Petnat. Then you've got tank method, or the Charmat method. It's got Martinotti method also behind it, known in Italy. And Prosecco is the most popular style of this. So think of Charmat or tank, huge tank, right? And you are fermenting inside the tank as opposed to taking each bottle and doing that individually. So not to say that it's not a good wine. It has nothing to do with that. It's just a different complexity and intensity from, say, something like a traditional method. And usually the grapes that are used for the tank method are meant to kind of show their varietal character, meaning they're clean, fresh fruits. They're very aromatic, again, hence like Prosecco. And then you've got transfer, carbonation, and continuous methods. We don't usually talk about those too much, but if you talk about carbonation method, it's kind of like if you have the soda stream at home and you're just inserting gas, that's what people do, and that's what you'll see kind of with the Andres and the cooks of the world, it's a very inexpensive way to produce bubbles. Now, that's why they are so inexpensive. Let's get into why traditional method is so intense and crazy and fabulous and more pricey. So this is the simplest explanation. Again, winemakers, beware. Simple explanation. Grape juice is fermented once. So you're doing everything that we said before, whether it was the red, rosé, or white wines. Comes in. You've got a base wine. It's bottled. Then you're adding a combo platter of yeast, sugar, and a little bit of wine, kind of like a winey syrup with yeast. And you're adding that into each individual bottle to start that second fermentation. Because what do we need for fermentation to make more alcohol? Yeast and sugar, right? And that produces heat and gas, CO2, right? So that's happening inside the bottle. The bottle is then again sealed. That yeast gets to work, does that little alcoholic fermentation. That gas has nowhere to go, so it stays within the bottle. There's so much pressure in there. And then you have yummy wine, right? Simple explanation for it. But what is all the fuss about this word champagne? So champagne comes from one region on the planet. Everybody say it with me. One region for champagne. So sparkling wine made in the same method is sparkling wine. It may have its own name. So in France, there are other regions in France that make wine in the same fashion. They're called Cremant or Monsieur. In Italy, we've got Franciacorta, we've got Alta Longa makes these styles, or Trento, and they're made in the Metodo Classico. Same thing, just different region. In Spain, you can have an Espumoso, which is the general speaking of it, or you can have a Cava, which you find in about 8 different regions that are designated. In Germany and Austria, there's a sparkling wine called Sekt. Now, I won't get too nerdy into it, but Sekt is usually a base wine, right? It's or a kind of more inexpensive wine. If it says Grand Reserve or Reserve Sekt, you know that you're getting something that was made in this traditional method, which has that secondary fermentation inside the bottle. In South Africa, it could either say MCC, which is Method Cap Classique, right? So champagne, we're gonna really kind of hone in though on champagne right now. So champagne is a region in France. It is also the labeling term that they are allowed to use on their wines. And it's not just any sparkling wine, right? It's a specific style from a specific region. Yes, I have to keep harping on that. And usually there's like 7 grapes, I'm pretty sure, that are still allowed. But we usually think of champagne as being made with Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier grapes. Those are the most predominant that we find on the market. There are some other names that you might see around the world that are synonyms for this. Méthode traditionnelle, champenoise method, traditional method, or secondary fermentation. So this usually requires the winemakers to hand harvest, which is crazy and intense as it is. And the whole process from start to finish is laborious, time consuming, and costs a lot more money than shooting some bubbles into a bottle or using a big tank. So I'm gonna go back to this as I kind of review, but this is a great just way to look at the basics of traditional method winemaking. So we usually start with those base wines. So in sparkling wine, you usually need something with a neutral but high acid base wine. And there's no bubbles in it yet, right? We haven't started with the bubbles. So this is usually something that they will take from various vineyards, and they will make a blend of these base wines, and it's called a cuvee. Then it's bottled, right? All of that still wine is bottled. It's fermented after it goes through that whole process, right? But then it's bottled. Then they decide to add that liqueur de tirage, which again is that yeast and like kind of sugary wine syrup. They seal it with something called a crown cap, the same thing you would find on your pet nats or your beers, right? And it starts its secondary fermentation. So this is the beginning of the traditional method. The wine is then aged. Now, by law in Champagne, it's 12 months. So those Lees that we were talking about, those cute little guys that said, who cares? I'm taking a break. And they die willingly, right? They are sitting in the bottle still. Now, lees can add complexity and texture and creaminess, right? But they also protect the wine from oxidation, from getting brown or like losing some of their complexity. A winemaker definitely can choose to age it for a lot longer on those lees to add even more. So as it's going through this process, you can see that little table there. That's called the riddling table. They have a few other things. Say in Spain, it's called a gyro palette, where it actually shakes on its own. But that dude there is the riddler. So he literally goes hand riddling, so giving little quarter turns every single time he goes by. And he can do up to like 5,000, maybe even more bottles in a single session. It's insane to me. So then it goes through that until all the sediment actually comes down to the neck. Then they know that it's time. The wine is then disgorged, right? So they're removing all of that sediment from the neck. And then the winemaker has their final thought process. Do I want this wine to be bone dry? Do I want it to be dry, semi-sweet, or sweet? And then they decide on that, and they add something called dosage. So dosage is actually the addition of a syrupy, again, a little syrupy mixture of cane sugar and a little of reserve wine. It has to be the same wine that they're using in the bottle, a little of that. And they add that according to what their preference, what they want the guest to actually experience when they open that bottle. So the amount of that is what you'll read on the bottle. So say you want something that is kind of in the Goldilocks zone, go for brut, because that can range anywhere though from 0 to 12 grams per liter, but typically that's considered kind of the Goldilocks. Cool? All right. So sparkling wine styles, we've got a few of them. So there's non-vintage or the multi-vintage. We kind of talked about that already. That's usually reflecting the house style, because then they can take wines from different vintages. Say this vintage was really rainy and moldy and they didn't get enough grapes. They can take a wine cuvee from say last year when it was really stellar and really bolster the wine to make it consistent every year. Then we have rosé. In Spain and Italy, it's called rosato and rosado. And vintage or millesamato, which we see in Italy a lot on the bottles. Those are only produced in the best years. Cream of the crop. Blanc de Blancs, which is a white wine, very much so made from 100% Chardonnay in most of the bottlings, especially only that in Champagne. And then Blanc de Noir is one of my favorite styles. So these are white wines. They look white usually, and they might have a little color to them, but they're made exclusively from black grapes, and they're just delicious. So I won't bore you too much with the laws, because the laws, they're quite extensive and they're very different in a lot of these different regions. But if you see something on a label, let's say it says AVA from a wine made in the United States, that means it's specific to that one region that it was made, and there's a lot of laws that go into it. Same thing with France, Italy, and Spain. And France is kind of the first lawmaker that we had. So then we have a few different practices. I call them of passion. So if you are interested and intrigued with, say, biodynamics or being sustainable or organic, there are different labels that you can find on your wines that can indicate and give you that indication that they are following these practices. Now, the organic rules in the United States are extremely different from the organic rules that you find in, say, Europe. But hopefully the goal is that they're becoming a little more stringent and a little more conscientious on what they mean. But it could mean that the winemaking facility is organic, and there's a lot of things that go into that, but the actual vineyards were not organic. And that's kind of the trouble that we're having with the organic label in the United States. In Europe, it's a lot more stringent. Biodynamics, that's a whole nother seminar as well. But it really has to do with the flow and the cycle of the universe. Our universe that we're in here on planet Earth, they follow the sun and the moon through the cycles. And there's a lot of stringent rules that go along with that. But if you are feeling that, say, you get headaches or you're not really sure why you don't feel good after wine, and you want to see if that's something that will alleviate it, go for an organic or maybe a sustainable style. In practice, they may use less of those chemicals that are found in the earth. So another style of wine, right? So we're on to our sweet wines. There's a lot of them that we have to choose from. Sadly enough, they have kind of fallen out of favor, except with great wine pairings and food. But there are many times that people don't even know how good a sweet wine can be. And you can have a sweet wine that is a dessert wine, or you can have a sweet wine that's somewhat more of a meal wine, right? I've heard stories of these great Sauterne dinners where the full meal was done with all Sauterne pairings, and it went over smashingly. But some wines have sugar levels that are already naturally high because of the grapes themselves, or high because the winemaker, or maybe the wine fermentation stopped on its own, was stopped before all of those yeasts ate up those sugars. So we have ice wine, there's dried grape wines, there's noble rot affected wines, there's a whole slew of things that can actually go into these. If you're drying the grapes, this is going to actually cause them to shrivel, like a raisin, right? Literally like shriveled up. And it really protects and kind of intensifies those, condenses the sugars and the acid in the wine. Sweetness can be added to the component if it's allowed by law. I don't really think that that happens in some of the greater noble wine regions, but it does happen. And then some more famous styles, we have Moscato d'Asti from Italy, Riesling from, say, Germany, and most of their styles, many of their styles are actually really dry styles, but a lot of times people associate Riesling from Germany as being sweet. Sauternes from France, from Bordeaux region, Tokai, which is some of the most expensive wines. If you get some of those like really old and intensely sweet, they go up to like 450 grams per liter. It's insane. You got to eat it basically with a spoon. Rutherglen Muscat from Australia. And then of course our ice wines. So ice wines are great. You have really cold temperatures. It's like usually around -8 degrees Celsius. And they are on the vines frozen, right? Or they can put them in a freezer. Some people do that, but they're on the vines frozen. They take those, they smush them, boom, you've got wines. And a lot of fortified wines fall into the sweet wine category. But fortified wines are simply adding booze to booze for even better booze. So how you're doing this is you are either interrupting fermentation in whatever way. Sometimes fermentation doesn't even happen, and sometimes you are stopping or halting fermentation during the process. So you're taking a base wine, which usually is kind of you're taking a base wine, and you're taking a distilled spirit, which is usually brandy, and you're adding that to that base wine to bolster it, right? So you're fortifying it, making it stronger. And this can end up being a dry or sweet style. So when you're talking about something like a vin de liqueur or a mustel, this is made with that fresh crushed juice. So they smush it, they bring it in, they crush it. It doesn't even get to start fermentation before they add some of that, say, brandy or distilled spirit. That is when you actually get that really true flavor or the qualities of those grapes, because it never had time to go through the fermentation process. And usually we see that with a lot of aperitifs. Fermentation that is interrupted during is called a vin du naturel, or VDN, and natural sweetness is allowed to reside. So you're kind of going through the fortification and then somebody goes, whoop, hold on. So you still have some sugars that are naturally left. Few popular types, we've got Madeira. So this comes off of the coast on an island called Madeira, Portugal. You can have sweet and dry styles of that. Marsala, which is made in Sicily. A lot of times we consider Marsala as a cooking wine because it used to be only considered that, and a lot of people use that namesake, and it really wasn't from Marsala. There's some really fabulous styles. Again, sweet and dry styles are made. Sherry, which is a great separate class as well. for all my sherry lovers out there. This can be either fortified before or during fermentation. It's a fun one, but it's produced in Spain, down in the southwest region of Andalusia. And you have sweet and dry styles that are made there. And then the best known that we have, and that's a little boat in the region of Port in the Douro Valley. For all you nerds out there, maybe you can put in the chat if you know what that boat is called as a little quiz for you. But this is the most widely known and most widely drank fortified wine. It comes in a tawny, ruby, vintage, and white style. So tawnies, those are usually those oxidative and very nutty styles, and then that focus on those kind of oxidative flavor components. Then you have ruby and vintage. So ruby is more fruit dominant, more fresh. And then you have vintage, which is a ruby, but it's made from a very specific year, and there's a lot more rules. And they've been really trying to play around with white port to make it into more like an aperitif. So these are some of the great regions of the world that make wine. There's a lot of them. In the United States alone, every single state makes wine. My hometown of New Jersey just is approving or trying to approve another AVA. I have not tried any wines from New Jersey, but we'll see how that goes down. But we, of course, really focus on the wines made on the West Coast and in New York on the East Coast. Anywhere in between, there is a varying level of quality based on all those factors of terroir that we spoke about. And then all over the rest of the world, we can recognize some of these great spaces. China is really starting to up their game as far as their winemaking and the regions and how much that they're making. So I hope, and I know that I cruised through a lot of this, but I hope in that time that we were able to really get an idea of what happens in the winemaking world, that you have a better understanding